She laughed with her friends when the quiet cowboy walked past. Dusty hat, torn boots, and eyes that never met hers. To her, he was just another poor drifter with nothing to his name. But when her family's farm was about to be taken away, a mysterious man stepped in and paid it all, in full. Only then did she learn the truth. The cowboy she once mocked was the one who had been silently watching over her all along. The sky had been burning all morning, not with fire, but with that slow, heavy kind of heat that pressed down on the plains like an iron skillet left too long on the stove. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the dirt roads, made horses flick their tails in irritation, made men pull their hats lower, and women gather their skirts closer as they hurried from shadow to shadow. But by noon, the wind had changed. It came in from the west, smelling of rain and distance, carrying with it the first whispers of a summer storm. The clouds rolled in like a herd of dark cattle, slow and inevitable, and the light beneath them turned gold and strange. The kind of light that made everything look like it was already a memory. That's when he rode into town. No one knew his name, no one asked. He came down the main road on a tired sorrel mare, her coat dull with dust, her gait uneven. She favored her left front leg, and every few steps she'd bob her head, patient but pained. The man in the saddle sat easy, shoulders relaxed, hat brim low enough to hide most of his face. His clothes were worn, denim trousers faded nearly white at the knees, a shirt that might have been blue once, now closer to gray. His boots were scuffed leather, cracked along the toes, stitched back together more than once. He didn't look at anyone as he passed, but they looked at him. Old Mr. Clemens, standing outside the post office with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, squinted at the stranger and muttered something under his breath. Two boys sitting on the edge of the water trough stopped their game of marbles to watch, wide-eyed and curious. A woman sweeping the steps of the boarding house paused mid-stroke, broom held still in her hands, her eyes following the rider like he was something out of place, a coyote wandering through a chicken yard. The horse limped to a stop near the general store, and the man swung down slow, like his bones were older than his face. He tied the reins loose to the post and ran a hand down the mare's neck, murmuring something too quiet to hear. Then he straightened, rolled his shoulders once, and walked up the steps into the store. The bell above the door chimed soft and lonesome. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with the smell of flour and leather and tobacco. Shelves lined the walls, canned goods, bolts of fabric, coils of rope, jars of candy that caught the light like little jewels. Behind the counter stood Mr. Haverford, a stout man with a white apron stretched tight across his belly and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He glanced up when the cowboy entered, nodded once, and went back to tallying his ledger. The cowboy moved through the aisles quiet as smoke. He picked up a small bag of oats, a tin of salve, a spool of wire, practical things, necessary things. He carried them to the counter and set them down without a word. Haverford rang them up, his fingers quick on the register keys. "That'll be $1.15. The cowboy reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, pennies, nickels, a few dimes, and counted them out slow, one by one, onto the wooden counter. His hands were calloused, scarred across the knuckles, the nails clean but ragged. Haverford swept the coins into his palm and dropped them into the drawer with a metallic clatter. "Need anything else?" "No, sir. Thank you." His voice was low, steady, polite. Haverford nodded again, already turning back to his ledger. The cowboy gathered his purchases and turned toward the door, but he didn't make it out, because that's when she walked in, Clara Whitmore. She came through the door like sunlight breaking through clouds, all confidence and color. Her dress was pale blue cotton, pressed neat and buttoned high at the collar, the hem swaying just above her polished boots. Her hair was pinned back in a careful twist, a few dark strands escaping to frame her face. She carried herself like someone who knew she was looked at, admired, expected to be admired. And she was. Behind her came two other women, friends or maybe just companions for the afternoon, chattering about the upcoming church social, about who would bring what pie, about whether the Johnsons' boy would finally work up the nerve to ask Mary Callahan to dance. Clara's laughter rang out bright and easy as she stepped inside, and the sound of it filled the store like wind chimes. But then she saw him, the cowboy, standing near the door, his hands full of oats and salve, his hat still low, his boots still dusty. Her eyes swept over him, quick, appraising, and something flickered across her face. Amusement maybe, or disdain. She turned to her friends, her voice just loud enough to carry. "Well, would you look at that," she said, her tone light, teasing. "Seems like the wind blew in all sorts of strays today." One of the women giggled. The other glanced at the cowboy, then away, her cheeks coloring. Clara's gaze lingered on his boots. "Goodness," she continued, tilting her head as if truly considering it. "I don't think I've ever seen leather hold together with that much hope and thread. You'd think a man would at least try to look presentable when he comes into town." The words landed soft, but they cut. The store went quiet. Mr. Haverford looked up from his ledger, his expression unreadable. The cowboy stood still, his hands steady on his purchases, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He didn't speak, didn't defend himself, didn't even look at her. He just shifted the bag of oats under one arm, tipped his hat, slow, deliberate, almost courteous, and walked past her toward the door. The bell chimed again as he stepped outside. Clara watched him go, a small smile still playing at the corners of her mouth. Her friends exchanged glances, and the conversation resumed, lighter now, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Outside, the wind was picking up. The cowboy untied his horse and led her away from the post, his hand resting gentle on her neck. He didn't mount right away. Instead, he stood beside her for a long moment, looking out at the darkening sky, at the storm rolling in like a promise. Then he swung up, into the saddle, turned the mare east and rode out of town the same way he'd come, slow, quiet, unbothered. Thunder rumbled low in the distance. By the time Clara and her friends left the store, the first drops of rain had started to fall, fat and heavy, kicking up little puffs of dust where they hit the ground. The women hurried toward their carriages, laughing and shrieking as the rain came faster, holding their skirts high as they ran. Clara paused at the edge of the boardwalk, looking out at the road where the cowboy had disappeared. For just a moment, she felt something tug at the edge of her thoughts, something uncomfortable, something she didn't quite want to name. But then her friend called her name and she turned away, shaking the rain from her sleeves, and climbed into the carriage. The storm broke wide open as they rode out of town. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the roads to mud, blurring the world into shades of gray and silver. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the plains in brief, blinding flashes. The thunder followed close behind, deep and rolling, like the earth itself was speaking. And out there, beyond the edge of town, beyond the eyes of anyone who might have cared to look, the cowboy rode on. He didn't hurry, didn't seek shelter. He just kept moving, slow and steady, his hat brim streaming water, his coat soaked through, his horse limping but willing. He rode until he found a cluster of cottonwoods near a dry wash, their branches low and wide enough to break the worst of the rain. There, he dismounted. He unsaddled the mare with care, running his hands over her legs, checking the swelling in her hoof. He spoke to her soft and low, the kind of voice a man uses when no one else is listening, gentle, patient, full of something that might have been affection. From his saddlebag he pulled a small lantern and a tin of matches. He struck one against his boot, cupped the flame against the wind, and lit the wick. The light bloomed warm and steady, pushing back the dark. He knelt beside the horse and opened the tin of salve he'd just bought, working it into the mare's injured leg with slow, careful fingers. She stood still, trusting, her ears flicking back toward him. The rain drummed against the leaves above, the wind hissed through the grass, and the man worked in silence, his face calm, his movements sure. There was no anger in him, no bitterness, just a quiet kind of dignity that needed no witness. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked out at the storm, at the lightning streaking the horizon, at the world washed clean and wild. And for a moment, just one, his gaze turned south, toward the dark outline of a farmhouse in the distance, toward a place he didn't yet know, toward a family that didn't yet know him. But the storm knew, the land knew, and the wind, as it swept across the valley, carried with it the scent of rain and dust and something else, something like change, like fate, like the slow turning of a wheel that had already begun to move. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The sky opened pale and wide, the clouds scattered thin across the horizon like torn lace. The air smelled fresh, new, full of earth and green things. Water pooled in the low places, glinting silver in the early light. The cowboy saddled his horse, doused the lantern, and rode on. He didn't look back, but somewhere miles away, in a farmhouse perched at the edge of the plains, a young woman woke to the sound of her father coughing in the next room. Clara sat up in bed, listening. The sound was rough, wet, the kind of cough that lived deep in the chest and wouldn't let go. She heard her mother's voice, low and soothing, and the soft shuffle of footsteps across the floor. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders and stared out the window at the pale dawn. And for some reason, maybe the storm, maybe the silence that followed, she thought of the man in the dusty boots. The way he'd stood there, still and quiet, while she laughed at him. The way he'd tipped his hat and walked away without a word. She frowned, pushing the thought aside. It didn't matter. He was nobody. Just a drifter passing through. She'd probably never see him again. But as the light grew stronger, and the morning birds began to sing, something lingered in the back of her mind. Something, small and sharp, like a splinter beneath the skin. A feeling she couldn't name. A sense that somewhere, somehow, the world had shifted just slightly off its axis, and nothing at all, would ever be quite the same again. The fields stretched out beyond the window, gold and green and endless. The wind moved through them like a long, slow breath. And far away, on a road no one was watching, a cowboy rode toward a future neither he nor anyone else could see. But it was coming, quiet, inevitable, already written in the dust and rain and thunder, already begun. As dawn broke over the soaked prairie, the laughter in town faded, but for Clara, its echo followed her home. The land looked tired. That's what Clara thought every time she stood on the porch and looked out at the fields, that the earth itself was exhausted, worn down to its bones, too weary to give anything more. The grass grew sparse and pale, struggling up through soil that had been worked too hard for too many years. The fences leaned at angles, wire sagging between posts that had started to rot at the base. The windmill creaked and groaned with every turn, its blades missing more slats than they kept, spinning lopsided against the sky like a broken clock that couldn't quite remember the time. And the barn leaned so far to the left it looked like it was trying to lie down. Her father said it had another year in it, maybe 2 if the winter wasn't too harsh. But Clara could see the way the beams bowed, the way the roof dipped in the middle like a swayback horse. She could see the gaps in the siding where the wind whistled through, the way the door no longer hung square in its frame. Everything here was holding on by habit, by stubbornness, by the sheer refusal to admit that letting go might be kinder than holding on. She heard the cough before she saw him. Her father came around the side of the house, moving slow, one hand pressed to his ribs. He'd been up since before dawn. She'd heard him stirring in the dark, heard the scrape of his boots on the floor, the soft groan he tried to muffle as he pulled on his coat. He was a tall man, or had been once. Now his shoulders curved forward, his spine bent like a question mark. His hair had gone gray years ago, but it was the kind of gray that looked less like age and more like ash, like something that had burned too long and finally gone cold. "Morning, Clara girl," he said, his voice rough and thin. "Morning, Pa." She came down the steps and took the bucket from his hand before he could protest. It was half full of water from the well, heavy enough that she could feel the strain in her shoulder as she carried it toward the house. He didn't argue. That's how she knew he was tired. Inside, the kitchen was warm with the smell of biscuits and coffee. Her mother stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her face flushed from the heat. She was a small woman, quick and quiet, the kind of person who could stretch a pound of flour into a week's worth of meals and never once complain about it. She looked up when Clara came in, her eyes searching her daughter's face the way they always did, looking for worry, for fear, for cracks in the mask Clara wore so carefully. "Your brother up yet? I'll get him." Clara set the bucket down and walked through the narrow hallway to the back room, where her younger brother slept in a bed pushed up against the wall. The quilt was tangled around his legs, one arm flung out across the pillow. He was 12, all elbows and knees and wild hair that never stayed combed for more than an hour. "Tommy," she said softly, shaking his shoulder. "Time to get up." He groaned and rolled over, burying his face in the pillow. "Come on, Ma's got breakfast ready." 5 more minutes. "You said that yesterday, and the day before, and I'll say it tomorrow too," he mumbled, but he sat up anyway, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. Clara smiled despite herself and ruffled his hair as she passed. By the time she got back to the kitchen, her father was already seated at the table, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. He stared down into it like he was reading something there, something only he could see. Her mother set a plate in front of him, 2 biscuits, a spoonful of gravy, a thin slice of salt pork, and he nodded his thanks but didn't move to eat. Clara sat across from him, her own plate untouched. "Pa," she said quietly, "when are they coming?" He didn't look up. "Thursday. And if we can't, we'll manage." His voice was firm, but there was something beneath it, something brittle, like ice that looked solid but wouldn't hold your weight. Her mother turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. "We've always managed," she said, her tone gentle but insistent. "We'll find a way." But Clara had seen the ledger. She'd seen the columns of numbers, the debts that grew faster than the crops, the payments that never quite caught up. She'd seen the letters from the bank, folded and tucked into the drawer, the ink polite but unyielding. She'd seen the way her father's hands shook when he counted out the coins, and she knew they were running out of ways. Thursday came too soon. The men from the bank arrived just after noon, riding in a black carriage that looked too clean, too new, against the dust and wear of the farm. They stepped down onto the hard-packed dirt in their pressed suits and polished shoes, carrying leather folders under their arms like shields. Clara watched from the porch as her father walked out to meet them, his hat in his hands, his back straight, even though she knew it hurt him to stand that way. The conversation was brief. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She could see it in the way the taller man opened his folder and pointed to something on the page, in the way her father nodded, slow and heavy, in the way the man in the suit smiled, polite, apologetic, empty. When they left, her father stood in the yard for a long time, staring at nothing. Clara came down the steps and stood beside him. "What did they say?" He didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the grass, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out, "Harsh and lonesome." "They gave us till the end of summer," he said finally. 3 months. If we can't make the payment by then." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Clara felt something cold settle in her chest, heavy and immovable. "We'll sell the calf," she said, "and the old plow, maybe some of Ma's quilts at the market. We'll—" Clara. Her father turned to look at her, and for the first time in her life, she saw something in his eyes that scared her more than anger, more than disappointment. Defeat. "It won't be enough," he said quietly. "It hasn't been enough for a long time." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him they'd find a way, that they always had, that they just needed to work harder, try harder, hope harder. But the words stuck in her throat, because deep down, she knew he was right. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her, the creak of old wood, the scratch of a branch against the window, the soft murmur of her parents' voices in the next room. She thought about the farm, about the fields her grandfather had cleared with his own hands, the barn her father had helped build when he was just a boy, the well they'd dug together one summer when the drought had gone on too long and the creek had run dry. She thought about her mother's garden, about the way Tommy liked to climb the old oak tree by the fence, about the way the light looked in the early mornings when the mist still clung to the ground. And she thought about losing it, all of it. The weight of it pressed down on her chest until she couldn't breathe. She sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders, and walked to the window. Outside, the moon hung low and bright, casting long shadows across the yard. The barn stood dark and crooked against the sky. The windmill turned slow and soundless, its broken blades catching the light like teeth. And for some reason, unbidden, unwelcome, she thought of the cowboy. The man in the dusty boots. The way he'd stood there in the store, silent and still, while she mocked him in front of everyone. The way he'd tipped his hat and walked away without a word, without anger, without anything at all. She felt her cheeks flush hot in the darkness. Shame was a strange thing. It came slow, crept up on you when you weren't expecting it, settled in your stomach like something spoiled. She thought herself clever that day, thought herself better. But now, standing in the quiet of her room with the weight of her family's future pressing down on her, she wondered, what had he thought of her? What had he seen? A proud, foolish girl who judged a man by the state of his boots? A girl who didn't know the first thing about struggle, about hardship, about the kind of dignity that didn't need fine clothes or polished leather to prove itself. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the night. But the night didn't answer, and the cowboy was long gone. Morning came gray and heavy. Clara woke early, dressed in her oldest work dress, and went out to help her father with the chores. They moved through the routine in silence, feeding the chickens, mucking out the stalls, checking the fence line for breaks. Tommy trailed behind them, kicking at rocks, asking questions neither of them had the energy to answer. By midday, Clara had made up her mind. "I'm going into town," she announced, pulling off her work gloves and setting them on the porch rail. Her mother looked up from the garden, concern flickering across her face. "What for?" "To see if anyone needs help, sewing, cleaning, anything. And to see what we can get for the calf." Her father shook his head. "Clara, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Her voice came out sharper than she meant, and she softened it, reaching out to touch his arm. "Let me help, Pa, please." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Take the wagon, and be careful." She hitched up the old mare, not the one they were selling, but the other, the one too old to work the fields but still steady enough for the road, and drove into town as the afternoon sun climbed high and merciless. The streets were quieter than they'd been the week before. A few people moved along the boardwalks, ducking in and out of shops, nodding polite greetings as they passed. Clara tied the mare outside the general store and walked inside, her heart beating hard against her ribs. Mr. Haverford looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Miss Whitmore, what can I do for you?" She hesitated, pride warring with necessity. "I wanted to ask if you know anyone who might need help. I can sew, mend, clean. I'm good with figures too if anyone needs books kept." Haverford scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I'll ask around. Can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can do. Thank you." She turned to leave, but something made her stop. "Mr. Haverford?" "Yes, miss. That man. The one who came in last week. The cowboy with the lame horse. Do you know where he went?" Haverford's expression shifted, something thoughtful crossing his face. "Can't say I do. He didn't say much, paid for his goods and left." "Why do you ask?" Clara felt her cheeks warm. "No reason. I just wondered." She left before he could ask anything else. Outside, she stood on the boardwalk and looked down the street, at the road that led out of town, at the place where the cowboy had disappeared into the rain. And somewhere, deep in the center of her chest, something ached. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd thrown away without ever knowing its worth. She climbed back into the wagon and drove toward the edge of town, where the stockyard sat dusty and loud with the sound of cattle and men shouting prices. She sold the calf for less than it was worth. She knew it, and the buyer knew it, but neither of them said anything. She took the money, thin and crumpled in her hand, and tucked it into her pocket. On the way home, she passed the widow Callahan's place, a small house with a tidy garden and a broken wagon sitting in the yard, and there, she pulled the mare to a stop. There, kneeling beside the wagon, his sleeves rolled up and his hat on the ground beside him, was the cowboy. He was working the axle free, his hands steady and sure, his face calm and focused. The widow stood nearby, wringing her hands, speaking to him in a voice too low for Clara to hear. He nodded, said something back, and returned to his work. Clara sat frozen, the reins slack in her hands. He didn't look up, didn't see her. But she saw him, saw the quiet patience in the way he moved, the kindness in the way he listened, the dignity in the way he worked without asking for anything in return. And the shame that had been simmering in her chest since that night by the window bloomed into something sharper, something that burned. She flicked the reins and drove on, her throat tight, her eyes stinging. By the time she got home, the sun was sinking low, painting the fields in shades of amber and shadow. Her father was waiting on the porch. She handed him the money without a word, and he counted it slow, his lips pressed thin. "It's a start," he said quietly, but they both knew it wasn't enough. That night, Clara sat by the window again, watching the stars come out one by one, and she thought about the cowboy, about the way he'd tipped, his hat in the store, about the way he'd knelt in the widow's yard, fixing what was broken without being asked. And she understood, finally, what she hadn't before. That pride was a brittle thing, that judgment was a mirror, and that sometimes the people you looked down on were already kneeling, not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to stoop low and lift others up. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered into the darkness, "I'm sorry." And somewhere out there, beneath the same stars, a quiet man finished his work, washed his hands in a cold stream, and lay down to sleep with nothing but the sky above him and the knowledge that he'd done what he could. It wasn't much, but it was enough, for now. But sometimes, the people we look down on are the ones already kneeling to help us stand. The storm came 3 days later, not the kind that announced itself with distant thunder and a slow darkening of the sky, but the kind that rolled in fast and mean, born out of nothing, swallowing the afternoon whole. Clara was in the garden when the wind changed. She'd been on her knees for the better part of an hour, pulling weeds from between the potato plants, her hands dark with soil, her back aching from the work. The sun had been warm on her shoulders, the air still and heavy, thick with the promise of summer. Then the temperature dropped. She looked up, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, and saw the wall of clouds moving in from the northwest, black and roiling, churning across the sky like something alive, something angry. "Tommy," she called, her voice sharp with urgency. Her brother was by the barn, throwing stones at a rusted tin can he'd set up on a fence post. He turned at the sound of his name, saw the look on her face, and ran. "Get inside! Now!" He didn't argue. Clara grabbed the basket of vegetables she'd picked and hurried toward the house, the wind already starting to pull at her skirt, whipping her hair loose from its braid. Her mother met her at the door, eyes wide, already moving. "Where's your father?" "Checking the north fence. He should be back by—" The first gust hit like a fist. It slammed into the side of the house hard enough to rattle the windows, and Clara stumbled, catching herself against the doorframe. The basket slipped from her hands, potatoes tumbling across the porch and rolling into the yard. "Leave them!" her mother shouted over the rising howl of the wind. "Get inside!" They barely got the door shut before the rain started. It came down in sheets, so thick and fast that within seconds Clara couldn't see past the porch rail. The wind screamed through the yard, tearing at the trees, ripping loose boards from the barn, sending everything that wasn't tied down skittering across the ground like tumbleweeds. Tommy pressed his face to the window, his breath fogging the glass. "Where's Pa?" Clara's heart was pounding. "He'll find shelter. He knows what to do." But her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. Her mother lit a lamp, though it was barely past noon, the world outside so dark it could have been twilight. They sat together in the kitchen, listening to the storm rage against the walls, against the roof, against everything they had. And then, a sound, sharp, splintering, like a tree snapping in half. Clara ran to the window and looked out, squinting through the rain. The barn, part of the roof had torn loose, the tarp they'd nailed over the weakest section now flapping wild in the wind, the boards beneath it exposed, already starting to splinter. "No," she breathed. "If the roof went, if the rain got in, they'd lose everything stored inside. The hay, the tools, the seed they'd saved for next season. Everything." She turned toward the door. "Clara, no!" Her mother grabbed her arm, her grip fierce. "You can't go out there. If we lose the barn, we'll survive. We won't survive losing you." But Clara was already pulling free, already reaching for her father's oilskin coat hanging by the door, already shoving her arms into the sleeves. "I'll be quick. I just need to tie it down." She didn't wait for permission. She shoved the door open and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit her like a wall, cold and brutal, soaking through her clothes in seconds despite the coat. The wind tore at her, tried to push her back, but she lowered her head and ran, across the yard, through the mud, toward the barn. The tarp was thrashing like a living thing, the ropes that had held it whipping loose, cracking in the air. She grabbed one end and pulled, straining against the wind, trying to drag it back over the exposed boards. It was like fighting the sky itself. Her hands were numb, her arms shook, the rope burned against her palms, and then a hand closed over hers. Clara gasped and spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, and there he was, the cowboy, soaked to the bone, his hat gone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, rain streaming down his face. He didn't say a word, didn't ask permission. He just took the rope from her hands and pulled, his jaw set, his shoulders straining as he hauled the tarp back into place. Clara grabbed the other end, and together they wrestled it over the gap, fighting the wind inch by inch, their boots slipping in the mud, their breath coming hard and ragged. He pointed toward the far corner, shouting something she couldn't hear over the roar of the storm, and she nodded, stumbling through the rain to grab the loose end of another rope. They worked in tandem, wordless, instinctive, her tying off one side while he secured the other, both of them moving fast, desperate, driven by the same silent understanding. By the time they finished, Clara's arms were shaking so hard she could barely hold the knots. But the tarp was down, the roof was covered, the barn would hold. The cowboy stepped back, chest heaving, and looked up at the sky as if daring it to try again. Then he looked at her. Their eyes met through the rain, and for a moment the world went still. Clara opened her mouth to say something, Thank you, maybe, or who are you, or why did you come back? But before she could find the words, he turned and started walking toward the house. She followed, half stumbling, her legs unsteady beneath her. Her mother threw the door open before they reached it, her face pale with relief and fury all at once. Get in here, both of you, before you catch your death. They staggered inside, dripping mud and water all over the floor, and Clara's mother slammed the door shut behind them, leaning her weight against it as if the storm might try to follow. Tommy stared at the cowboy, his mouth hanging open. Who? Sit, Clara's mother said, pointing at the table. Both of you. I'll get towels. Clara sank into a chair, her whole body trembling, from the cold, from the effort, from something else she couldn't name. Across from her, the cowboy sat quiet, his hands resting on his knees, water pooling at his feet. He didn't meet her eyes. Her mother returned with 2 rough wool blankets and draped one over Clara's shoulders, then hesitated before offering the other to the cowboy. He took it with a nod, his voice low. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. You just risked your fool neck out there, both of you. The barn, Clara started, is still standing. That's more than I can say for your common sense. But her hands were gentle as she poured hot coffee into 2 tin cups and set them on the table. The cowboy wrapped his hands around the cup, and Clara noticed for the first time how scarred they were, knuckles white and rough, old wounds layered over older ones, the kind of hands that had known work and weather and worse. What were you doing out there? Clara asked quietly. He glanced up at her, his eyes dark and steady. Riding past, saw the storm coming and thought. He paused. Thought maybe you'd need a hand. You came all the way, back here just because of the storm. He didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of coffee, his gaze dropping back to the table. Seemed like the right thing to do. Something twisted in Clara's chest. Before she could say anything more, the door burst open and her father stumbled in, drenched and breathless, his eyes wild until they landed on her. Clara, thank God. I saw the roof from the ridge and thought. He stopped. His gaze shifted to the cowboy sitting at his table, wrapped in his blanket, drinking his coffee. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Clara's father straightened, pulled off his soaked hat, and walked slowly to the table. You helped her, he said, not a question. The cowboy nodded once. Clara's father studied him, long and careful, the way a man studies something he doesn't yet understand but knows matters. Then he extended his hand. James Whitmore. The cowboy stood and took it. Elijah. Just Elijah? Just Elijah. James nodded slowly, still holding his gaze. Well, Elijah, I owe you. No, sir, you don't. My daughter could have been hurt out there. She wasn't. Because of you. Elijah looked uncomfortable, his shoulders shifting beneath the blanket. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't, James said quietly. You did. The storm raged on outside, but inside the kitchen, the air had softened. Clara's mother set another cup of coffee on the table and pulled out a chair. Sit, James. You look half drowned. He obeyed, sinking into the seat with a grunt of relief. Tommy was still staring at Elijah, his eyes wide with something like awe. Where's your horse? Tied under the lean-to by the ridge. She'll be all right. The one with the bad leg? Elijah nodded. Is she better now? Getting there. Can I see her when the storm stops? Tommy, Clara's mother said, her tone warning, but Elijah smiled, small, fleeting, but real. Sure, if it's all right with your folks. Tommy grinned so wide it looked like his face might split in half. The storm lasted through the afternoon and into the evening, the wind finally easing as the sun began its descent behind the clouds. By the time the rain stopped, the world outside was soaked and battered, the yard a mess of mud and broken branches, the air cool and smelling of wet earth. Elijah stood to leave. You should stay, James said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. Stay? Clara's mother echoed. The night, at least. It's nearly dark, and the roads will be a mess. You can sleep in the barn. It's dry enough now, thanks to you. Elijah hesitated. I don't want to impose. You're not. James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. And if you're looking for work, well, I can't pay much, but I could use the help. Roof needs mending, fences need fixing. Plenty to do before winter. Clara's breath caught. Elijah looked at her father for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his face. Then he nodded. All right, I'll stay. For a while. Good. James stood and clapped him once on the shoulder. We'll settle the details in the morning. That night, after Elijah had gone out to the barn with a blanket and a plate of food, Clara stood by the window and watched the lantern light flicker through the cracks in the siding. You think he'll stay? Tommy asked, appearing at her elbow. I don't know. I hope he does. Clara didn't answer. But as she watched the soft glow of the lantern and listened to the quiet settling of the house around her, she realized she hoped so too. The days that followed were strange and new. Elijah worked like a man who understood silence, who didn't need words to know what needed doing. He rose before dawn and was already halfway through the morning chores by the time Clara came outside. He mended the fence line, patched the barn roof properly, oiled the hinges on the windmill so it turned smooth and quiet again. He didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't ask for anything, just worked. But there was something in the way he moved, something steady and sure, that made the farm feel less broken, less hopeless. Clara found herself watching him, not in the way she'd watched him that first day in town, with judgment, with disdain, but with something closer to curiosity. He was careful with the animals, gentle in a way that surprised her. She saw him once, kneeling beside one of the barn cats that had gotten its paw caught in some wire, speaking to it soft and low while he worked it free. The cat didn't scratch him, didn't run, just sat there, ears back, and let him help. He hummed sometimes when he thought no one was listening, low, wordless tunes that drifted through the yard like the wind. It made the place feel warmer. One evening, after supper, Tommy convinced him to show him how to braid a lasso, and the two of them sat on the porch while the light faded. Elijah's scarred hands guiding Tommy's smaller ones through the motions, patient and unhurried. Clara stood in the doorway, drying dishes, and watched. Her father sat beside them in his chair, smoking his pipe, his eyes distant but peaceful. Her mother hummed a hymn in the kitchen, and for the first time in months, maybe longer, the house felt like a home again. That night, Clara stepped outside to bring Elijah a jar of water and found him sitting on an overturned crate near the barn, his back against the wall, staring up at the stars. She hesitated, then walked over and held out the jar. Thought you might be thirsty. He looked up, surprised, and took it with a quiet, "Thank you." She should have left then, should have gone back inside. But instead, she sat down on the edge of the porch steps a few feet away and looked up at the same sky. "You didn't have to come back," she said after a while. "I know, but you did." He didn't answer right away. When he spoke, his voice was soft, thoughtful. "Sometimes you see someone struggling and you just—" He paused. "You help, that's all." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for what I said in town, about your boots." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "It's all right. It's not. I was cruel. And you didn't deserve it." He took a slow drink of water, then set the jar down beside him. "People say things," he said. "Doesn't mean they know what they're saying, or why. That doesn't make it right, no, but it makes it human." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Not anger, not bitterness, just understanding. And maybe somewhere beneath it, a sadness that had nothing to do with her. "Why do you help people?" she asked, "when most wouldn't even notice?" He smiled faintly, almost to himself. "Because someone helped me once, when I didn't deserve it." He didn't say anything more, and Clara didn't ask. But as she stood and walked back toward the house, she felt something shift inside her, something small but irreversible, like a seed cracking open in the dark. The wind moved through the fields. The stars burned cold and bright, and in the barn, a quiet man lay down to sleep, his hands folded over his chest, his face turned toward the rafters. He didn't dream, but if he had, it would have been of fields blooming green and gold, of laughter carried on the wind, of a place where the past didn't matter and the future was still unwritten, a place like this. Yet peace, like spring grass, is fragile, and the sound of boots from town carried the scent of change. The harvest fair came to town the first Saturday in August. It was an old tradition, one that stretched back before Clara was born, a day when the valley gathered to celebrate the summer's yield, to trade goods and gossip, to forget for just a few hours the weight of work and worry that hung over every homestead like a shadow. The main street was lined with tables and wagons, overflowing with jars of preserves, woven baskets, hand-stitched quilts, fresh bread wrapped in cloth. Children ran between the stalls with sticky fingers and bright laughter. Fiddlers sat on the steps of the church, their music spilling out across the crowd like water, and the air smelled of roasted corn and cinnamon and dust. Clara walked beside her mother, Tommy darting ahead of them, his pockets full of the pennies their father had given him to spend. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and for the first time in weeks she felt something close to lightness. Elijah had stayed behind. He'd offered to come, to help carry anything they bought, but her father had waved him off with a tired smile. "You've earned a day's rest. Take it." Elijah had nodded, said nothing, and returned to the barn to finish oiling the plow harness. Clara had looked back once as they pulled away in the wagon, and she'd seen him standing in the yard, his hat in his hands, watching them go. Something in his stillness had stayed with her the whole ride into town. Now, as she moved through the crowd, nodding to familiar faces, accepting compliments on the quilt her mother had brought to sell, she found her thoughts drifting back to the farm, to the quiet man who'd become part of their days without ever asking to be. He'd been with them for 3 weeks now, 3 weeks of steady work and few words, 3 weeks of small repairs and patient hands, 3 weeks of Tommy trailing after him like a shadow, asking 100 questions, and Elijah answering each one with the same calm attention. Her father had stopped coughing as much, started sitting on the porch in the evenings again, smoking his pipe, his shoulders less hunched. Her mother hummed while she worked, and Clara didn't know what to call the feeling that had settled in her chest, but it was warm and unsettling all at once, like standing too close to a fire. "Clara." She turned to see Mary Callahan waving at her from across the way, her bonnet ribbons trailing in the breeze. Clara smiled and made her way over, her mother following close behind. "I was hoping I'd see you," Mary said, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Have you tried the apple cider from the Johnson stand? It's divine." "Not yet. We only just got here." "Well, you must. And you have to tell me." Mary leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Is it true you've got a hired hand staying at your place?" Clara blinked. "How did you—" "Mrs. Henderson saw him in your yard last week. Said he was the same drifter who came through town a while back. The one with the awful boots." Clara's smile faltered. "He's helping my father with repairs," she said carefully. "That's all?" "Oh, I'm sure it is." Mary's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "But you have to admit, it's a little peculiar, a stranger just showing up like that. Don't you wonder where he came from?" "Not particularly." That was a lie. She wondered all the time. But she wasn't about to admit it to Mary Callahan, who would spread it across the valley by sundown. "Well, I think it's romantic," Mary sighed. "Like something out of a story. The mysterious cowboy, the struggling farm." "It's not romantic," Clara said, her tone sharper than she intended. "It's just work." Mary raised her hands in mock surrender. All right, I didn't mean anything by it." But her smile said otherwise. Clara excused herself and moved on, her mother shooting her a knowing glance but saying nothing. They spent the next hour wandering the fair, buying a small sack of flour, a spool of thread, a tin of tea they couldn't really afford, but that her mother insisted would lift their spirits. Tommy returned with a carved wooden horse and a face smeared with molasses, grinning like he'd won a fortune. It was nearly noon when Clara saw the sheriff. He was standing near the edge of the crowd, talking to a group of men outside the saloon, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his badge glinting in the sun. Sheriff Daniels was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a gray beard and a voice that carried like a hammer on an anvil. He wasn't smiling. Clara wouldn't have thought anything of it. The sheriff always looked serious. But then she saw who he was talking to, her father. James stood with his hat in his hands, his head slightly bowed, listening. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, and even from a distance Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. Something was wrong. She started toward them, her heart picking up speed, but her mother caught her arm. "Let him be," she said quietly. "Ma, something's—" "I know, but not here, not now." Clara bit her lip and stayed where she was, watching as the conversation continued, the sheriff leaning in, saying something low and firm, her father nodding once, twice, then turning away. He walked toward them with his head down, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "James?" Her mother's voice was soft, careful. "We're leaving," he said. "But we just— now." There was no room for argument in his tone. They gathered Tommy, loaded what little they'd bought into the wagon, and left the fare behind. No one spoke on the ride home. Clara sat in the back, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the town disappear behind them, the music and laughter fading into the distance. Her father's hands were tight on the reins, his knuckles white. And she knew, whatever the sheriff had said, it wasn't good. By the time they reached the farm, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the fields. Elijah was by the barn brushing down his mare, but he looked up when he heard the wagon approach. His expression shifted the moment he saw their faces. James climbed down without a word and walked straight into the house. Clara's mother followed, her hand on Tommy's shoulder, guiding him inside. Clara stayed in the yard, her feet rooted to the ground, her chest tight. Elijah set down the brush and walked over slowly, his eyes searching hers. What happened? She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she shook her head and turned toward the house. Inside, her father was pacing the kitchen, his hat thrown onto the table, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "James," her mother said gently, "please, sit down." "I can't." "Then tell us what he said." He stopped, his back to them, his shoulders rising and falling with each breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "The sheriff asked me about Elijah." Clara's stomach dropped. "Asked me where he came from, how long he'd been here, what I knew about him." "And what did you say?" her mother asked. "That he was a good worker, that he'd done right by us, that I didn't care where he came from?" "And?" James turned, and the look on his face made Clara's blood run cold. "He told me to be careful. Said Elijah's wanted." The word hung in the air like smoke. "Wanted for what?" Clara's voice came out barely above a whisper. Her father rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly looking years older. "A fight. Down in a town south of here, maybe 2 years back. A man died." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "The sheriff said it might have been self-defense, might have been something worse. Said there was never a trial, no conviction, but—" He paused. "But people remember, and they talk." "Did he say Elijah was dangerous?" her mother asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "No. He said he didn't know. Said to use my own judgment. But he warned me that if word gets around, if people find out we're keeping him here, it could cause trouble." "Trouble," Clara repeated numbly. "For us," her father said quietly. "For the farm. The bank's already looking for reasons to take this place. If they think we're harboring a—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Tommy stood in the doorway, his eyes wide and confused. "Is Elijah bad?" "No," Clara said quickly, too quickly. "No, he's not." But even as she said it, doubt crept in like frost. That night, Clara couldn't eat. She sat at the table, pushing food around her plate, her mind racing. She thought about the way Elijah had helped her in the storm, the way he'd worked without complaint, the way he'd been kind to Tommy, gentle with the animals, patient with her father. But she also thought about the shadows in his eyes, the way he never talked about where he'd been, the way he always seemed to be looking over his shoulder, even when he didn't think anyone was watching. A man died. The words echoed in her head, relentless. After supper, she went outside. The moon was rising, pale and round, casting silver light across the yard. She walked toward the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs. Elijah was sitting on the ground outside, his back against the wall, a tin cup in his hands. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Clara crossed her arms and took a breath. "The sheriff told my father about you." Elijah went very still. "About the man who died." He set the cup down slowly, his jaw tightening. "I see. Is it true?" He looked at her for a long moment, and the weight in his gaze made her chest ache. "Yes." The single word hit her like a stone. "Did you—" Her voice cracked. "Did you kill him?" "I fought him," Elijah said quietly. "He drew on me first. I was faster." "Why?" "Because if I wasn't, I'd be the one in the ground." Clara wrapped her arms tighter around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm night air. "You could have told us. Would you have let me stay if I had—" She didn't answer, because she didn't know. Elijah stood slowly, brushing the dust from his trousers, his movements careful, deliberate. "I didn't come here to bring trouble," he said. "And I won't. I'll leave in the morning. You don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm but not unkind. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her throat tighten, something that looked like regret, or maybe resignation. "You've got a good family, Clara, a good home. Don't let me be the reason you lose it. But Tell your father I'm grateful. For everything." He turned and walked into the barn, and Clara stood there in the moonlight, her hands trembling, her heart breaking in a way she didn't understand. She wanted to go after him, wanted to tell him to stay, that they'd figure it out, that he didn't have to run, but the words stuck in her throat, because she was afraid, not of him, but of what keeping him might cost. So she turned and walked back to the house, her footsteps heavy, her chest hollow, and she told herself it was the right thing to do. The morning came gray and cold. When Clara woke and looked out the window, the barn door was open. Elijah's horse was gone. So was he. The only sign he'd been there at all was the neatly stacked firewood by the house, the freshly oiled tools in the barn, and a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a stone on the porch rail. Clara picked it up with shaking hands and unfolded it. The handwriting was rough but careful. "Thank you for the kindness. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. The fences are done and the roof should hold through winter. Take care of each other. E." Beneath the words, tucked inside the fold, were $3 silver. Payment, she realized, for his stay, for the food, the shelter, the chance to rest, as if any of it had been a transaction, as if he hadn't given them far more than he'd taken. Clara sank down onto the porch steps, the paper clutched in her hands, tears burning hot behind her eyes. Tommy came outside, saw her face, and stopped. "He's gone, isn't he?" Clara nodded, unable to speak. Tommy sat down beside her, his small shoulder pressing against hers. "I liked him," he said quietly. "Me too," Clara whispered. And as the sun rose over the empty fields, the wind carried the scent of autumn, of endings, of change, of things lost that could never quite be found again. Inside, her father stood by the window, his hand resting on the sill, his face drawn and tired. He didn't say anything, but Clara saw the way his jaw worked, the way his fingers clenched and released, the way he looked out at the horizon, as if searching for something he knew was already gone. And she understood. They'd made a choice, the safe choice, the reasonable choice. But as the days stretched on and the work grew harder without Elijah's steady hands, as the fences began to sag again and the barn creaked, louder in the wind, Clara couldn't help but wonder if they'd chosen wrong. And as the first frost touched the fields, the farm felt colder without his quiet humming in the mornings. October came in quiet and cruel. The mornings turned sharp with cold, the grass stiff with frost that melted slow beneath a pale sun. The leaves on the cottonwoods turned gold and then brown, falling like prayers no one answered, piling up in the corners of the yard where the wind forgot them. The days grew shorter, the work grew harder, and the weight of what they'd lost, what Clara had let slip away, settled over the farm like a shroud. Her father tried. He woke before dawn every morning, pulled on his coat despite the pain in his back, and went out to do the work that needed doing. But Clara could see the way he moved now, slower, stiffer, his breath coming hard after even the smallest tasks. The cough had returned, worse than before. She'd hear it in the night, rattling through the thin walls, and she'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, her chest tight with a fear she couldn't name. Tommy did what he could, but he was still just a boy, all eagerness and no strength, his hands too small for the tools, his arms too weak for the weight of the work. Clara herself worked until her hands bled. She mended fences that sagged again within days. She hauled water until her shoulders burned. She chopped wood until blisters rose and burst and rose again, the axe handle slick with blood she didn't bother to wipe away. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The windmill broke in the first week of November. One of the blades snapped clean off during a storm, and the whole mechanism ground to a halt, the gears locked and useless. Without it, they had to haul every bucket of water by hand from the well, a task that ate hours from every day, hours they didn't have. Her father stood beneath it, staring up at the broken blades, his face gray and defeated. "I can fix it," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. Clara looked at him, at the tremor in his hands, at the way he had to brace himself against the fence post just to stay upright, and her throat closed. "I'll go into town," she said. "See if anyone can come out and—" "We can't afford it. We can't afford it, Clara." The words were final. He turned and walked back toward the house, his shoulders hunched, his stride uneven, and Clara stood alone in the cold wind, staring at the broken wheel turning uselessly above her. That night, the first snow fell. It came soft and silent, dusting the fields in white, covering the mud and the dead grass, making everything look clean and new and false. Clara watched it from the window, her arms wrapped around herself, and thought about Elijah. She thought about the way he'd fixed the windmill before, patient and sure, his hands knowing exactly what to do. She thought about the way he'd hummed while he worked, low and steady, a sound that had made the farm feel less empty. She thought about the look in his eyes the night she'd confronted him, the quiet acceptance, the lack of anger, the dignity in his sorrow. And she hated herself, hated that she'd let fear win, hated that she'd chosen safety over trust, caution over kindness, hated that he was out there somewhere, alone in the cold, while they struggled here without him. "You're thinking about him again." Clara startled, and turned to find her mother standing in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face soft with understanding. "I didn't—" "It's all right," her mother said gently. She crossed the room and stood beside Clara, looking out at the falling snow. "I think about him too. Do you think we were wrong?" Clara's voice came out small, fragile. "To let him go?" Her mother was quiet for a long moment. "I think we were afraid," she said finally, "and fear makes us do things we wouldn't otherwise do, makes us protect what we have even if it means losing what we need. I should have stopped him. Maybe. Or maybe he needed to go." Her mother reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Clara's ear, her touch warm and steady. "But that doesn't mean you can't regret it." Clara's eyes burned, but she blinked the tears back. "What if something happens to him? What if he's— Then we'll live with it," her mother said quietly, "the same way we live with everything else." But her voice was sad, and Clara knew she regretted it too. The weeks crawled by, each one colder and harder than the last. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through their hides, their eyes dull and listless. 2 of them died in the first freeze, and they didn't have the strength to bury them properly, just dragged them to the far edge of the property and left them for the scavengers. The wagon axle cracked on the road to town, stranding them halfway with a load of supplies they couldn't carry, and it took Clara and her father 3 hours to limp the wagon home, the wheel wobbling dangerously with every turn. Her father paid a man in town to weld it back together, and the cost took the last of the money from selling the calf. The debts piled up like the snow, silent, relentless, suffocating. Clara kept a ledger now, the way her father used to, writing down every expense, every coin spent, trying to make the numbers work. They never did. No matter how many times she added them, subtracted them, rearranged them, the answer was always the same. They were drowning, and there was no hand reaching down to pull them out. In early December, the bank sent another letter. Clara's father opened it at the kitchen table, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unfold the paper. He read it once, twice, his lips moving soundlessly, and then he set it down and stared at the wall. "James?" Her mother's voice was barely a whisper. "They want a payment by the end of the month," he said. "Half of what we owe. If we can't make it—" He didn't finish. Her mother sank into a chair, her face pale. Tommy looked between them, his eyes wide and frightened. "What does that mean?" "It means we have 3 weeks, Clara said, her voice hollow. 3 weeks to come up with money they didn't have. 3 weeks to save a farm that was already lost. 3 weeks until everything her family had built, everything they'd fought for, everything they were, would be taken away. She excused herself from the table, walked out onto the porch, and let the cold air burn her lungs. The snow was falling again, thick and heavy, covering the world in white. And Clara stood there shaking, not from the cold, but from the rage and helplessness churning inside her. They'd done everything right, worked themselves to the bone, sacrificed, saved, struggled. And it still wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She pressed her hands to her face and let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, muffled against her palms, and the snow kept falling. Quiet, indifferent, burying everything. Christmas came and went, barely noticed. There was no money for gifts, no energy for celebration. They ate a small meal of potatoes and gravy, and her mother sang a hymn in a voice thin and tired, and then they all went to bed early because there was nothing else to do. Tommy cried himself to sleep that night. Clara heard him through the wall, trying to muffle the sound in his pillow, and she wanted to go to him to tell him it would be all right, but she couldn't, because it wouldn't be. The day after Christmas, Clara was in the barn searching for a length of rope to patch the fence when she saw it. A small wooden box, tucked into a corner near where Elijah used to sleep, half hidden beneath a pile of old burlap sacks. Her heart stuttered. She knelt and pulled it out, brushing the dust away. It was plain, unvarnished, the kind of box that might have held tobacco or nails. She lifted the lid slowly. Inside was a horseshoe, old and rusted, bent slightly out of shape, and a folded piece of paper. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as before, rough but careful. "Kindness has roots. Don't forget yours." That was all. No signature, no explanation. Just those 5 words. Clara sank down onto the floor. The box clutched in her lap, and the tears she'd been holding back for months finally came. They poured out of her in great, wrenching sobs, shaking her whole body, and she didn't try to stop them. She cried for the farm, for her father's broken body and her mother's tired eyes and Tommy's lost childhood. She cried for the fear and the shame and the endless crushing weight of trying and failing, and she cried for Elijah, for the kindness he'd shown them when they didn't deserve it, for the trust she'd broken, for the man she'd driven away because she'd been too afraid to believe in something good. When the tears finally stopped, she sat in the silence of the barn, the box in her hands, and felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet, but something close, a quiet, stubborn refusal to give up, a reminder that kindness had roots, and maybe, just maybe, those roots went deeper than she knew. She stood, tucked the box into her coat pocket, and walked back out into the cold. The snow had stopped, the sky was pale and clear, the sun a distant smudge of gold on the horizon, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt like she could breathe. New Year's came. 1885 turned to 1886 in silence and snow. Her father sat at the table with the ledger open in front of him, a pen in his hand, staring at the blank page as if willing the numbers to change. They didn't. On the 2nd day of January, 2 men arrived in a black carriage. Clara saw them from the window and felt her stomach drop. The bank. Her father met them in the yard, his hat in his hands, his back straight despite the pain. Clara stood on the porch, her mother beside her, Tommy pressed against her side. The conversation was short. The men spoke in low, polite voices, their expressions carefully neutral. One of them opened a leather folder and pointed to something on the page. Her father nodded again. And then his shoulders sagged. The men tipped their hats, climbed back into the carriage, and drove away. For a long time her father just stood there, staring at the ground, the paper clutched in his hand. Then he turned and walked slowly back toward the house. Clara met him at the steps. "Pa?" He handed her the paper without a word. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the lines of text, and her breath caught. It was a notice. Formal, legal, final. The farm would be repossessed at the end of the month. They had 4 weeks to vacate the property. 4 weeks to pack up their lives and leave the only home they'd ever known. Clara's hands went numb. The paper slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the ground. Her father walked past her into the house, and she heard the door to his room close softly behind him. Her mother picked up the paper, read it, and folded it carefully, her face expressionless. "We'll manage," she said quietly, but her voice was hollow. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl around the house, and thought about everything they were about to lose. The fields her grandfather had cleared, the barn her father had built, the garden her mother had planted every spring for 20 years, the tree Tommy loved to climb, the porch where they sat on summer evenings, the home that had held their whole lives, gone, all of it. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. She thought about the horseshoe in the wooden box, about Elijah's words, "Kindness has roots." And she wondered, if kindness had roots, then maybe it had branches too. Maybe it reached farther than she knew. Maybe it came back, even when you didn't expect it, even when you didn't deserve it. Maybe, the thought was too fragile to finish, but it lived there, in the dark, like a candle flame cupped in trembling hands. And Clara held on to it, because it was all she had left. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, endless, covering the world in silence. And somewhere, far beyond the valley, beyond the mountains, beyond the places any of them had ever seen, a man rode through the cold with his collar turned up and his hat pulled low, his breath misting in the frozen air. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stop moving, couldn't let himself look back. Because if he did, if he let himself think about the farm, about the family, about the girl with the fierce eyes and the broken pride, he'd turn around, and he couldn't. Not yet. Not until he'd done what he'd set out to do. So he rode on through the snow, through the dark, through the cold that bit down to the bone, and he carried with him a single, stubborn hope. That kindness did have roots. That someday, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, they'd bloom. But just as the winter reached its cruelest silence, a stranger rode back through the snow. The last week of January came in bitter and gray. The sky hung low, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the wind cut across the valley like a blade. The trees stood bare and black against the horizon, their branches clawing at the clouds, and the fields stretched out empty and white, silent as a grave. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, a crate of her mother's dishes wrapped in old newspaper balanced on her hip, and looked out at the land one last time. They'd been packing for 3 days. Everything they owned, everything they could carry, was being loaded into the wagon, piece by piece, memory by memory. The furniture her grandfather had built, the quilts her mother had stitched, the books her father had read to her when she was small, Tommy's wooden horse, the one Elijah had admired that day on the porch, all of it going into crates and trunks, ready to be hauled away to where? They didn't know yet. Her father had a cousin 2 counties over who'd offered them a room until they could find work, find a place, find some way to start over. But starting over meant leaving the house where Clara had been born, leaving the fields where her brother had learned to walk, leaving the graves of her grandparents tucked beneath the oak tree on the hill, leaving everything. She set the crate down and pressed her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. She wouldn't cry, not now, not when her father needed her to be strong, when her mother was holding herself together with nothing but sheer will, when Tommy kept asking questions no one could answer. She wouldn't cry, but God, it hurt. Clara. She turned to see her father standing at the edge of the barn, his coat buttoned crooked, his face drawn and pale. They're here. Her stomach dropped. Already? He nodded. She followed him out into the yard, her boots crunching on the frozen ground, and saw the carriage coming up the road, black and polished, pulled by 2 gray horses, moving slow and deliberate like a funeral procession. Her mother stood on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, Tommy pressed close to her side. No one spoke. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the house, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the door opened. A man stepped down, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark wool coat that looked expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of coat a man wore when he had money but didn't need to prove it. His boots were polished, his trousers pressed, his hat fine but simple. He turned toward them, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. Because she knew that face, knew those eyes, knew the way he stood, quiet, still, like a man who'd learned long ago that strength didn't need to shout. Elijah. But not the Elijah she remembered. This man was clean-shaven, his hair trimmed neat, his face no longer shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. He looked different, older, maybe, or just more himself, like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down. Clara's father took a step forward, his mouth opening and closing, confusion and disbelief warring on his face. Elijah? The man nodded once, a small, almost shy smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Mr. Whitmore, what are you doing here? Elijah glanced at the carriage, then back at James, and his expression grew serious. I need to go into town, he said quietly. There's something I have to do, but I wanted to stop here first, he hesitated. To see you. Before what? Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges crisp and official-looking, and held it out. James took it slowly, his hands shaking, and unfolded it. Clara watched her father's face as he read, watched the confusion deepen, then shift into shock, then into something she couldn't name. His lips moved soundlessly. I don't understand. What is it? Clara's mother called from the porch, her voice tight with worry. James looked up at Elijah, his eyes wide. It says, the deed to this property has been transferred, that the mortgage is, his voice cracked, that it's been paid in full. The world seemed to stop. Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her, felt the air go thin and strange. Paid? Her mother whispered. James turned the paper over, as if searching for some explanation, some proof that it wasn't real. By who? Elijah met his gaze steady and calm. By me. Silence. Thick and absolute. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. You—" James shook his head, his voice barely audible. "You bought our farm?" "Yes, sir, but how? Where did you—" "I came into some money," Elijah said quietly. "An inheritance. From my father. He passed last year and—" He paused, his jaw tightening. It took a while to settle, but once it did, I knew what I wanted to do with it. James stared at him, his face pale, his hands clutching the paper, like it might dissolve if he let go. "Why?" he breathed. "Why would you do this?" Elijah looked past him, toward the house, toward the barn, toward the field stretching white and still beneath the gray sky. "Because you gave me something when I had nothing," he said. "You gave me a place, kindness, trust, even when you didn't have to, even when it would have been easier not to." He looked back at James, and his eyes were steady, clear. "I wanted to give that back, but this is—" James's voice broke. "This is too much. We can't—" "It's done," Elijah said gently. "The bank's been paid. The deed's in your name. It's yours. Free and clear." Clara's mother made a sound, half sob, half gasp, and covered her mouth with her hands. Tommy was staring at Elijah like he'd just walked out of a storybook, and Clara couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there, rooted to the frozen ground, as the weight of what he'd done crashed over her like a wave. He'd saved them. Not because he owed them, not because he wanted something in return, but because he could, because he was good, because that's who he was. James took a step toward him, his face crumpling. "Elijah, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. But after what happened, after we let you leave, I understood," Elijah said quietly. "I didn't blame you. I never did. You should have," James whispered, his voice thick with shame. "We were afraid, and we let that fear—" "It's all right," Elijah said, and the kindness in his voice was almost unbearable. "It's all right." James reached out, his hand trembling, and gripped Elijah's shoulder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then James pulled him into an embrace, his arms tight, his shoulders shaking. Elijah stood still for a heartbeat, surprised. Then slowly, carefully, he returned it. Clara turned away, tears streaming down her face, her chest heaving with silent sobs. Her mother came down from the porch and wrapped her arms around her, and they stood there together, holding each other, holding on to the impossible, miraculous gift they'd been given. When James finally pulled back, his face was wet, his eyes red. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "Thank you." Elijah nodded, his own eyes bright. "There's one more thing," he said. He turned back to the carriage and opened the door, reaching inside. When he straightened, he was holding a leather satchel, worn but well kept. He handed it to James. "There's enough in there to get you through the winter, seeds for spring planting, and a little extra in case—" He hesitated. "In case you need it." James opened the satchel with shaking hands, and his breath caught. It was full of money, bills neatly folded, coins wrapped in paper, more than they'd seen in years. "Elijah," James breathed. "It's what you need," Elijah said simply. "Take it." Clara's mother was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth, her whole body trembling. Tommy looked between them all, his eyes wide, his face full of wonder. And Clara finally found her voice. "Elijah." He turned toward her, and their eyes met. For a moment, the world fell away, the cold, the snow, the people around them, and it was just the two of them, standing in the space where words had once cut and now could only heal. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, for what I said, for what we did, for—" "Clara," his voice was soft. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She took a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. "You came here and gave us everything, and I judged you, I mocked you, I let you leave when you should have stayed, and you still—" Her voice cracked. "You still came back." Elijah took a step toward her, and the look in his eyes was so gentle it made her chest ache. "I didn't come back for an apology," he said quietly. "I came back because I wanted to. Because this place—" He glanced around, at the house, the barn, the fields. "Because you all mattered to me. And I wanted to make sure you were all right. But we don't deserve—" "Yes, you do." His voice was firm now, certain. "You deserve kindness, Clara. You deserve a home. You deserve to be all right." He paused, his gaze holding hers. And I wanted to be the one to make sure of it. Clara couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there shaking as the truth of it settled over her. He'd come back, not for revenge, not for recognition, but for them, for her. Elijah stepped back, tipping his hat to James, to her mother, to Tommy. I should go, he said. I need to finish things in town and… Stay, James said suddenly. Please, stay. At least for tonight. Let us… His voice wavered. Let us thank you properly. Elijah hesitated. We've got room, James pressed. And your old spot in the barn's still there, if… No, Clara's mother said, her voice gentle but firm. She wiped her eyes and straightened, smoothing her apron. Not the barn. He'll stay in the house, in the guest room. Elijah opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand. I won't hear otherwise, she said. You've given us everything. The least we can do is give you a proper bed and a warm meal. Elijah looked at her, then at James, then at Clara, and slowly he smiled. All right, he said quietly. Just for tonight. But Clara saw something flicker in his eyes, something that looked like relief, like homecoming, and she knew, in that moment, that he'd been as lonely as they'd been lost. That night, they sat around the table together, not as strangers, not as employer and worker, but as family. Clara's mother cooked the best meal they'd had in months. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, biscuits warm from the oven. She'd used the last of their stores, spent the last of their provisions, but none of them cared. Because tonight, they weren't packing, weren't leaving, weren't losing everything. Tonight, they had a home. And the man who'd given it back to them sat at their table, his coat hung by the door, his face warm in the lamplight. And Clara watched him laugh at something Tommy said, and felt her heart crack open in the best possible way. After supper, they sat by the fire. James and Elijah talked quietly about the spring planting, about what repairs still needed doing, about how to use the money wisely. Her mother darned socks, humming softly under her breath, her eyes bright and peaceful. Tommy fell asleep with his head on Elijah's shoulder, and Elijah didn't move, just let the boy rest, his hands settling gently on Tommy's back. And Clara sat in the corner, watching all of it, memorizing every detail, the warmth of the fire, the sound of voices low and easy, the scent of wood smoke and coffee and home, and the quiet, steady presence of the man who'd walked into their lives as a stranger and left as… what? A friend? Something more? She didn't know. But as the fire burned low and the night deepened, Elijah looked across the room and met her eyes. And in that look was everything she couldn't say: gratitude, regret, hope, and something else, something fragile and new, like the first green shoots pushing up through snow: forgiveness. And maybe the beginning of something neither of them had dared to name. Outside, the wind had stopped. The snow lay still and perfect, glowing faint beneath the stars. And the farm, the land that had been broken and weary and given up for lost, breathed and waited and began ever so slowly to heal. When spring finally came, the land bloomed not with wealth but with forgiveness. The first thaw came in early March. It started as a whisper, a drip from the eaves at midday, a patch of dark earth showing through the white, the soft rustle of wind that no longer bit, but only brushed against the skin. The snow pulled back slow, reluctant, revealing the world it had buried, and beneath it, the land was waiting. Clara stood at the edge of the north field, her boots sinking into the soft mud, and watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. The air smelled different now, cleaner, sweeter, full of possibility. She could hear the creek running again, the ice broken free, the water singing its way down through the valley. Behind her, the farmhouse stood solid and sure, smoke curling from the chimney, the windows glowing warm with lamplight. The barn no longer leaned. Elijah and her father had spent the better part of February shoring up the frame, replacing rotted beams, leveling the foundation. It stood straight now, proud, its new door hung square and true. The windmill turned smooth and silent, its blades all accounted for, spinning easy in the morning breeze. And in the fields, green was beginning to show. Not much, just hints of it, small and stubborn, pushing up through the mud and the dead grass. But it was there, life returning. The land remembering what it had been, what it could be again. Clara heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Elijah approaching. 2 tin cups in his hands, steam rising from them in the cool air. Thought you might want some coffee, he said, his voice still rough with sleep. She smiled and took the cup, wrapping her cold fingers around it. Thank you. He stood beside her, looking out at the same view, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It had been like this for weeks now, these quiet moments, shared without need for words, a language they'd learned together, built from work and silence and the slow, careful rebuilding of trust. Elijah had stayed. After that first night, Clara's father had asked him, not as an employer but as a man asking a favor of a friend, to stay on through the winter, to help them get the farm back on its feet, to be part of what they were building. And Elijah had said yes. He'd moved his few belongings into the small guest room off the kitchen, a space that had once been used for storage but now held a narrow bed, a single chair, and a shelf where he kept his hat and a few books he'd bought in town. He didn't ask for payment, didn't ask for anything. Just worked, steady and sure, as if he'd always been there, as if he'd always belonged. And slowly, so slowly, Clara almost didn't notice it happening. The farm had come back to life. Your father wants to start planting next week, Elijah said, taking a sip of his coffee. If the ground stays soft. He's excited, Clara said. I haven't seen him like this in years. He's a good man. He is. She paused, glancing at Elijah. You gave him that back. His hope. Elijah shook his head. I just gave him time. The hope was always there. Clara looked down into her cup, watching the steam curl and fade. I used to think, she said quietly, that strength meant not needing anyone, that asking for help was weakness, that if we just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, we could do it all on our own. And now, she looked up at him, her eyes bright in the early light. Now I think strength is knowing when to let someone help you, and grace is being the kind of person who does. Elijah's expression softened, and for a moment something passed between them, something warm and unspoken, like sunlight through water. You've changed, he said gently. So have you. He smiled, small and genuine. Maybe we both needed to. They stood there as the sun climbed higher, turning the sky from pink to gold to pale, endless blue, and the world around them woke. Birds began to sing, tentative at first, then bolder, filling the air with sound. A rabbit darted across the field, its white tail flashing. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed, and the chickens in the yard started their restless clucking, eager to be let out to scratch and peck. Life, everywhere, stubborn and relentless and good. Come on, Elijah said, nodding toward the house. Your ma's probably got breakfast ready by now. Clara followed him back across the muddy ground, and as they walked, she felt something settle inside her, something that had been restless and aching for so long she'd almost forgotten what peace felt like. But this was it, this quiet morning, this simple walk. This man beside her, steady as the earth. This was peace. Inside the kitchen was warm and full of light. Her mother stood at the stove, flipping flapjacks on the griddle, humming a tune Clara recognized from childhood. Tommy sat at the table, already halfway through a plate piled high, syrup on his chin, grinning like he'd won a prize. Her father was at his usual spot, the newspaper spread out in front of him, his coffee steaming, his face more rested than it had been in months, maybe years. The cough had faded, his hands were steady. The gray pallor had lifted from his skin, replaced by the ruddy color of a man who'd been working outdoors, who'd been eating well, who'd been sleeping sound. He looked up when they came in and smiled. About time you two came in from your daydreaming. We weren't daydreaming, Clara said, hanging her coat by the door. We were planning. Planning what? Tommy asked, his mouth full. Don't talk with your mouth full, her mother said automatically, setting a plate in front of Clara. Tommy swallowed with exaggerated effort. Planning what? Elijah sat down and reached for the syrup. Your father and I are going to start turning the south field next week. Get it ready for planting. Can I help? Tommy's eyes went wide with excitement. If your schoolwork's done, their father said, I'll do it, I promise. Then yes, you can help. Tommy beamed and went back to shoveling food into his mouth. Clara watched them, her family whole and together and laughing, and felt her throat tighten with something too big for words. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief. Or just love, pure and overwhelming. After breakfast, Clara and her mother worked in the garden. They'd cleared it the week before, pulling away the dead stalks and weeds, turning the soil, adding compost from the pile behind the barn. Now they were marking out rows, planning what to plant where, potatoes here, Beans there, tomatoes along the south edge where they'd get the most sun. It was slow, careful work, and Clara loved it. Loved the feel of the earth under her hands, the smell of it, rich and dark and alive. Loved the rhythm of it. Dig, smooth, measure, mark. Loved the quiet company of her mother, their movements synchronized after years of working side by side. "You're happy," her mother said after a while, not looking up from the row she was smoothing. It wasn't a question. Clara sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. I'm glad." They worked in silence for a few more minutes, the sun warm on their backs, the breeze soft and easy. Then her mother paused, her hands resting on the handle of the hoe. "He's a good man, Clara." Clara's breath caught. "Ma, I'm not asking, I'm just saying." Her mother looked at her then, her eyes kind and knowing. "He's a good man, and he looks at you like—" She paused, searching for the words. "Like you're the morning." Clara's cheeks flushed hot. We haven't, I know." Her mother smiled gently. "But someday, maybe, when you're both ready." Clara looked down at the dirt, her heart beating hard. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what she felt even. All she knew was that when Elijah was near, the world felt steadier, safer, like she could breathe a little deeper, stand a little taller, like she didn't have to carry everything alone. And maybe that was enough, for now. The weeks turned soft and green. The fields, once barren and broken, began to fill with life. Tiny shoots of wheat pushed up through the soil in neat, endless rows. The vegetable garden exploded with growth, lettuce and radishes and peas climbing their stakes, reaching toward the sun. Wildflowers bloomed along the fence line, painting the edges of the farm in purple and yellow and white. The cattle grew sleek and healthy, their coats glossy, their eyes bright. The chickens laid more eggs than they had in years. Even the old barn cat, who'd been thin and standoffish all winter, started to fill out, lounging in the sun and purring when Tommy scratched behind her ears. Everything was healing, and Clara was learning to let go of the fear that had gripped her for so long, of the shame that had haunted her since that day in town, of the belief that she had to be perfect, had to be strong, had to hold everything together, or it would all fall apart. She was learning to trust in the land, in her family, in Elijah, and in herself. One evening in late April, after supper had been cleared and the dishes washed, Elijah asked her to walk with him. They went out past the barn, past the fields, up the gentle slope to the old oak tree where her grandparents were buried. The sun was setting, the sky awash in shades of amber and rose, and the air was full of the sound of evening birds settling in for the night. Elijah stopped beneath the tree and looked out at the farm spread below them, the house with its lights glowing warm, the barn standing tall, the fields rolling green and gold into the distance. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. Clara stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. "About what? About staying?" Her heart skipped. "You are staying," she said carefully. He paused, choosing his words. "Staying for good. Making this—" He gestured at the farm, at the valley, at everything around them. "Making this home." Clara's breath caught. "Is that what you want?" He turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her chest ache. "I've spent most of my life running," he said quietly. "From my past, from my mistakes, from people who thought they knew me. I never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home, never let myself." He paused. "But here," his voice thickened, "here, I feel like I could—" "Then stay," Clara whispered. "I don't want to overstep. This is your family's land, your home, and Elijah." She reached out and took his hand, and he went still, his eyes wide. "You're already part of this family. You have been since the day you came back." She squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "Stay. Please." He stared at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, carefully, he smiled. "All right," he said. "I'll stay." And Clara felt something in her chest break open and bloom, like spring breaking through winter, like light spilling into dark. They stood there beneath the oak tree, as the sun sank lower, their hands still joined, the world around them soft and golden and full of promise. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara felt whole. Summer came in warm and kind. The days stretched long and sweet, full of work and laughter and the simple rhythms of life. They harvested the early vegetables and replanted for the fall. They mended fences and whitewashed the barn and built a new henhouse that Tommy insisted on painting red. Elijah and James worked side by side in the fields, their shirts damp with sweat, their faces tanned and smiling. They talked as they worked, about the weather, about the crops, about nothing and everything, and the easy companionship between them was something Clara had never seen her father have with anyone, not even his own brother. Her mother baked pies with the first cherries from the tree by the house and set them on the windowsill to cool, and the smell of them drifted through the yard like a memory. Tommy grew taller, his voice starting to crack, his questions getting sharper and smarter. He followed Elijah everywhere, learning how to fix things, how to read the sky, how to be patient with animals and gentle with the land. And Clara learned how to be still, how to sit on the porch in the evenings and just listen, to the crickets, to the wind, to the low murmur of voices around her. How to let herself be happy without waiting for something to take it away. How to love without fear. One night in July, there was a dance in town. The whole valley turned out for it. Families and neighbors, old friends and new. Lanterns were strung between the trees, and someone had set up a makeshift stage where a band played fiddle and banjo and guitar, the music fast and joyful. Clara wore her Sunday dress, the pale blue one, and her mother braided her hair with ribbons. Tommy complained about having to wear his good shirt, but put it on anyway when their father gave him a look. And Elijah wore a clean shirt and a vest, his hair combed back, his face shaved smooth, and when he offered Clara his arm to walk into town, she took it without hesitation. They danced that night. Not just once, but over and over, until Clara's feet ached and her face hurt from smiling. Elijah wasn't a graceful dancer. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned late in life. But he was steady, and he held her like she was something precious, and that was enough. More than enough. At one point, as they spun beneath the lanterns, Clara looked up at him and saw the way the light caught in his eyes, the way his smile softened when he looked at her, and she thought, this is what it means to come home. Not a place, but a person. When the music slowed and the night grew late, they walked back toward the farm together, the stars bright overhead, the air cool and smelling of hay and honeysuckle. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. But when they reached the edge of the property, Elijah stopped and turned to her. "Clara," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her heart beating fast. "I know I don't have much to offer," he said. "No land of my own, no grand plans. Just—" He paused, his jaw working. "Just myself. And a promise that I'll take care of you and this place and everything that matters, for as long as you'll let me—" Clara's breath hitched. "Are you—" She couldn't finish the question, but he understood. "I'm asking," he said gently, "if you'd consider, someday, letting me be more than just a hired hand, more than just a friend." Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. "Yes," she whispered, his eyes widened. "Yes, yes." She laughed, the sound breaking free like a bird taking flight. "Yes, Elijah, someday, when we're ready." He let out a breath, and the relief and joy on his face was so pure, so unguarded, that Clara couldn't help herself. She rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, soft, tentative, but it was everything. And when she pulled back, he was smiling, really, truly smiling. "Someday," he repeated as if testing the word. "Someday," she agreed. And they walked the rest of the way home together, hand in hand, the future stretching out before them like the fields, uncertain, yes, but full of promise, full of life, full of light. Autumn came gentle and gold. The harvest was good, better than it had been in years. The grain stood tall and heavy, the corn ripened sweet, the apples hung red and perfect on the trees. They worked long days, all of them together, bringing it in before the first frost. And when the last wagon was loaded and the last bushel stored, James stood in the center of the barn and looked around at the abundance and wept, not from sadness, but from gratitude. They celebrated that night with a feast. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, potatoes and gravy, apple pie with cream. They ate until they were full, laughed until their sides hurt, and when the evening finally wound down, they sat together on the porch and watched the stars come out. Tommy fell asleep in his chair, his head lolling to one side. Clara's mother dozed against her father's shoulder, and Elijah and Clara sat side by side, their fingers intertwined, their faces peaceful in the soft glow of the lamplight. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. Elijah glanced at her. "For what? For coming back, for staying, for—" She paused, her voice thick. "For believing we were worth saving." He squeezed her hand gently. "You were always worth it," he said. "You just needed someone to remind you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his cheek on her hair, and they sat like that as the night deepened and the world grew still. And the farm breathed, steady, whole, home. Winter would come again, as it always did. There would be hard days and lean times and struggles yet to face, but they would face them together, as a family, as people who had learned that kindness had roots, deep and strong and enduring, and that those roots could hold you steady even when the storms came. That forgiveness was not weakness, but the bravest kind of strength. That home was not a place you held on to, but a place that held on to you. And that sometimes the people you once looked down on were the ones who lifted you highest. Clara closed her eyes and let herself rest, let herself believe, let herself be still. And in the quiet of that moment she heard it, the land whispering, "Remember. Remember the dust and the rain, and the winter that nearly broke you. Remember the stranger who came with nothing and gave everything. Remember the grace that saved you when you thought you were lost. Remember." And she did. She would. Always. The stars turned overhead, the wind moved through the fields, and the farm, the land that had been tired and broken and given up for lost, bloomed, not with flowers, not with gold, but with something far more precious, with love, with hope, with home. And in the doorway of the old farmhouse, someone had hung a rusted horseshoe above the frame, bent and worn, but still whole. A reminder, a promise, a benediction. Kindness has roots. And here, in this place, in this family, in this love that had been tested and proven and finally allowed to grow, those roots ran deep, deep enough to hold, deep enough to last, deep enough to remember, forever. The dust has settled. The land and the hearts upon it have finally come home.